I'm thinking we should be able to finish up with the Japanese material with this one. Um, so last time I was going through Buddhism and how you have all these variations, if you would, from temple to temple or network to network, with these commonly shared beliefs, but no formal structure whatsoever. When the Meiji comes to power in the 1870s, 1880s, he and his senior statesmen, as I mentioned earlier, I was talking about Shinto, decide that Shinto, they're going to actually invent, design, if you would, a new form of the Shinto religion, which basically will do two things. One is encourage imperial worship. So they're going to make the emperor into a god, whereas before he was sort of like a Shinto priest. His job was to intercede with the goddess Amaterasu. Now they're going to promote him, I guess, for lack of a better term. What they're also going to do then is in making state Shinto a new religion, they of course have to now downplay and in fact to a certain extent make traditional Shinto invisible because they don't want them competing. They don't want anything to compete with state Shinto. Now, not surprisingly, if you take that a step further, then all of a sudden Buddhism becomes a huge problem for these guys because Buddhism really isn't involved in the day to day, but it also, among other things, says that everyone's following their own path. So that doesn't fit this whole sort of nationalization, everyone doing the same thing, everyone worshiping the emperor type of thing. In fact, it contradicts it pretty thoroughly. So the Meiji period shows they almost eradicate Buddhism. A large proportion of Buddhist priests are put in prison by the Kempeitai and just disappear. Very few of them ever make it out. A large number of the Buddhist temples were shut down. Now, what they did rather cleverly is in many cases they didn't shut down the temple. They converted, well, they converted the temple. And what they did is they converted the temple to bureaucratic, headquarters for the secret police or some other bureaucratic function. And then the Buddhist temples, in many cases, became the storage places or repositories of formal government documents, especially the Japanese version of the Wahuko, the Koseki. So the Buddhist temples pretty much get all shut down and or converted to other uses, which actually is very similar to what at a slightly later period is what the Communist Party does in China to the Taoist and especially Confucian, but also Taoist and to certain extent Buddhist temples from the 1940s into the 1970s, till the end of the Cultural Revolution, as it was. Yeah, so anyway, so the Japanese are doing this from, basically 1880, 1890 into 1945. Now, what this means is for, 60 something years, you not only have traditional Shinto basically locked out, you've also done everything you can to discredit and destroy Buddhism in all its forms in Japan. Now, this, on the other hand, in a weird way, what happens is the samurai who are now military and the sort of militarism, nationalism that becomes the Japanese way from the 1880s to the 1940s. On the other hand, embraces Zen Buddhism, or I should say the philosophy of Zen. Actually, no, so they embrace the philosophy of Zen, in various subparts of that, like the tea ceremony. And they also embrace the idea of Buddhist logic when it comes to militarism, especially Bushido. So their new reinvention of Bushido, the sort of reinvention of the function of Zen, is sort of weird little bits of Buddhism get kept at the same time they're intentionally getting rid of the 99.9% of the religion or what's visible. World War II ends. State Shinto's made outlawed. Shinto sort of staggers back a little bit, but the population has moved so much they become much more urbanized. Especially by the 1950s and 1960s, everyone's moving to the cities, and Shinto at its base is really a rural agricultural religion. It's people in a village, a farming area, in touch with the world around them. excuse me, think of that Hida village Shinto shrine. So Shinto has a hard time back, and it's never really reinvented itself completely. To be all Japanese embrace Shinto, but it doesn't have the centrality to their life, that it used to. Buddhism has exactly the same problem, for different reasons, since Buddhism deals with different stuff. But Buddhism has the same problem when it tries to come back post World War II, for one thing. Since all the temples were largely separate, and since each group of immediate priests were generally sort of an Oyab Koban relationship with the abbot or whoever was the head of the temple complex, since those folks have all pretty much died in prison or vanished, it's very hard for temples to sort of reintegrate themselves. A lot of the ceremonies, a lot of the basic prayer systems aren't in common use anymore. There's been 60 years of the government consciously trying to get rid of them, and erase, arresting and executing anyone who's found practice in it. So it's hard for the religion to make it back, and it hasn't. Um, Most folks, I'd say the vast majority of Japanese, are technically Buddhist. They still do Buddhist ceremonies, especially for birth and for death, and some other ceremonies. But the classic thing they've done in Japan ever since World War II is they've surveyed folks. I think Asahi Shimbun or one of the newspapers has surveyed folks and asked them if they're religious. And the vast majority of Japanese say no, they don't have a religion. Now, they still do Shinto ceremonies. They still go to Shinto temples. They still do Buddhist ceremonies. They still go to Shinto Buddhist, temples or shrines. Um, but yeah, it's hard to figure out just exactly how much people are actually engaged in all this and sort of a centerpiece of their day-to-day lives. I think the philosophy is still pretty much there, but I'm not sure if they've really integrated it back to religious practices, especially the group under 50 years of age. So in that context, what then happens though, is given Durkheim's analysis, his original analysis, that people have to have some sense of understanding that the world has function, the world has purpose, that things have a reason for happening, even if you're not privy to it. And of course, that was always the function of religion. And so, post World War II, especially with the traumas of World War II, it's, Japanese probably needed that more than a lot of folks did. They basically, their country got wiped out for all intents and purposes. So what happens is, because Shinto and Buddhism aren't, sort of stepping up to the plate and are being embraced by everyone, is sort of like, oh, good, we can come back to this and get these answers. What happens is, by the 50s, especially by the 60s, is that new religions start up. Now, these are invariably almost always parts of Buddhism or spun off of Buddhism. And they're a classic example of what we call revitalization movements. Oops, where we go here. Now, revitalization millenarian movements are real common. They were first noticed, I suppose you would say, in anthropology in the period from the 1930s and 40s, when they were looking at when Australian, especially Australian anthropologists and colonial officers were looking at the sudden rapid growth of just a ton of new religions in the Western Pacific, specifically Melanesia. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. First, they thought it was political movements like were happening in India. They thought it was other stuff they didn't know. So they brought in anthropologists, and they realized that what you had was totally separate, in most cases, totally unique movements that became labeled as a very peculiar, interesting package as revitalization movements. Once they realized these are sort of pan-Melanesian, these are oftentimes also called millenarian movements, which really is an accurate revitalization, much more accurate term. They realized that these weren't unique to the Western Pacific. These were actually typical when you put any society in a situation of what you might call belief stress, for lack of a better term. If you put a society collectively and individually in a situation like that, you will get a revitalization movement. And so when I started to realize this appears to be one of a very small set of universals or pan-human phenomena that you see in groups when this particular scenario sets up. So it doesn't matter where the group is. And in fact, the United States is a classic example right now of a revitalization movement, has been probably since the 1930s or certainly since the 1950s. Um, and Japan gets this post World War II. I think pre World War II they didn't have it. Pre 1945 they didn't have it simply because the government had such tight control on everything. And Japanese have a real strong sort of tradition, if you would, of belief in authority. So if authority says do it, then they do it. Um, when that suddenly collapses in 1945, when the authority's gone, then all of a sudden, bang, what do you replace it with? So revitalization movements are absolutely fascinating. And like I say, that you have them in the United States right now. You had them in Hawaii in the 1840s through the 1880s, with all sorts of religions that start up in various parts of Hawaii. With this idea of coming up with a new set of logics and answers to a world that the traditional religion couldn't answer effectively. And that's the key. What you have is revitalization movements happen when the religious beliefs or the social religious beliefs that you have don't seem to adequately address the world you find yourself in anymore. When the disconnect becomes too great, when it becomes sort of essentially an example of, well, this is what I was taught, but it doesn't seem to work anymore, and no one seems to be following it anymore. So when you lose your sense of belief, because you have to remember, religions are not based in facts. Religions are always, I don't care what religion is, all religions are belief based. The believers make a religion. And there's tons of religions which have disappeared simply because there's no believers anymore. So religions depend on their believers to exist. And if those believers, come to the conclusion that religion isn't providing them with the guidance that they need to get through their lives, then they're not going to just get rid of that religion. They're going to find something to replace it. Durkheim was adamant that people need to have a sense of certainty in the world around them. If they're going to find, if they're not going to find in religion X, then they're going to go to religion Y or invent a new religion that will address those issues or this crisis they find themselves in. So in Japan, by the 1950s, 60s, you get these new religions starting up all over the place. They're invariably based largely on sort of very simple versions of aspects of Nietzschean and Buddhism, the vast majority of them. So let's go through sort of the logic of these, because we're talking about Japan here, but you have to remember that this would apply equally in regard to the United States in the 2020s. First off, you have to have a charismatic leader. In this regard, very much like a traditional shaman, at least in Japan. There has to be someone who presents himself and is seen by the believers as being a manifestation of the value of this new religion. In most cases, this person's actually seen as sort of like an interpreter of the religion and proof that the religion is valid and works. So they're sort of like the uber believer. But the key here is they have to be charismatic. They can't, they can't just be somebody. They have to have, a level of public conviction, I guess, for lack of a better term, or salesmanship, or what do you want to call it, that gets folks to believe in what they have to say in their message. Soka Gakkai was probably the most famous of these in the 70s and 80s. It became absolutely huge. They used to have yearly rallies here in Hawaii, I believe into the early 2000s. I can't remember when the last one was. As typical with a lot of these, it fragments into subgroups. What happened is the original founder passes away, and two or three, I can't remember how many, guys that were sort of like the number 2 level leaders, split because they couldn't agree on stuff. And if you think about it, especially in the Japanese logic, that makes sense because that's traditional Japanese religion. Each temple, each belief thing was sort of split off into its own, its own kuleana. Key thing here is with revitalization movements, is that the believers are believers. And there's a lot of segregation that goes on between believers and non-believers. This applies in several ways. One is non-believers think the believers are nuts. They just think that the believers are off, in left field doing weird stuff. The believers think the non-believers are, not only wrong, but they're misinformed and a whole mess of stuff. So there becomes a real segregation between insiders and outsiders. And again, you can see where, especially in Japanese society, as we've already gone through, this resonates, of course, in a lot of ways with the society in general. So what this means is when you join, we'll use Soka Gakkai as an example because they're still big. When you join Soka Gakkai, the folks in your company and your kinship group and whoever else you're a part of who don't believe in Soka Gakkai are starting to think, whoa, and they're going to back away a little bit from you. So what that does, of course, is that pushes your commitment to the group. More and more you get pushed into the Soka Gakkai envelope because no one else, like teenagers would say, no one understands me. So in this context, the only folks that now understand you are the other Soka Gakkai members. So it becomes this ever-growing divide, gap between believers and non-believers. Second part is these revitalization movements always have an incredibly simple religious logic. They're incredibly easy to understand. My argument is a good revitalization movement shouldn't take more than 30 seconds to figure out, and maybe 2 or 3 minutes to memorize whatever chants or things that you've got to know to show that you're a believer. These are real 21st century, Instagram, TikTok, attention level religions. There's no large text to consume. There's no Bible. There's no Quran. There's not the various sutras to remember, even like just the Lotus Sutra. So these religions are incredibly easy to consume. They're incredibly easy to learn. And this is a huge part of a revitalization movement. It always has real simple slogans. It doesn't matter whether the slogans are particularly clear, but the slogans they're repetitive. People say the slogans all the time. The slogans become like chants. And then in that logic, then more and more, that becomes your marker of membership. Invariably in these religions, Soka Gakkai is a perfect case in point, they come up with very, very much sort of here and now logics. Buddhism traditionally in Japan dealt with birth and death. So for most of your existence, like if you're having a crappy week of work, Buddhism isn't going to help you. And I suppose to a certain extent Zen might in terms of, balancing your emotions out. But it's not something Buddhism is interested in. Even Shinto is not going to be particularly useful. You might have to go to a temple and you get a good luck charm that's going to help you, protect you through the week. But that's not, unless you're a really deep-seated believer, that's not really going to be all that effective in terms of dealing with the crap that you're going to put up with from, 9 to 7. These new religions invariably link themselves to the idea that if you follow this religion, in this case, if you follow Soka Gakkai, you're going to have a better life daily. You're going to have a better life weekly. You're going to have more stuff. You'll be more successful. You have a nicer house. You have more furniture. Whatever it is you want, you can get it if you believe enough in Soka Gakkai. So you can feel your happiness here and now. So it's a very immediate gratification logic that underlies classic revitalization movements. And you see this, super in the United States. And in Japan, this is the new religions. And again, most Japanese, this is the first or maybe second generation that's moved to the cities. They've moved to urban areas. They've lost their social network back home. They've generally abandoned home. That's the huge millions of IKEA abandoned properties across Japan. That's not folks where the whole kinship group vanished. It's just where they've said, we're out of here, and they're not going back to the country. Being in the city is a new thing. It's not something they've had generations dealing with, and they have a hard time with it. This is where they're very different than the Chinese. Chinese have been urban dwellers for probably 3,500, 4,000 years. Any individual family hasn't been in a city, but cities have been part and parcel of Chinese social identity, religion, etc. for thousands of years. In Japan, you have to remember that basically till the turn of the 20th century, till the 1900s, Japanese were almost invariably rural farmers. Cities were largely, sort of bureaucratic / religious centers, but they weren't cities in the, sort of classic context till the 20th century. So urban life is new. The Japanese are having a real hard time with it. The new religions invariably have a very hierarchical, strongly centralized organization. In most cases, it looks very militaristic. So it's a real hierarchy in terms of levels of authority. all of course focusing on this charismatic leader where sure, stuff comes down. Again, think of like the general of each part of an army. Then you've got the colonels and the majors and the captains and lieutenants and everything down to the sergeants. That's how these organizations work. Some of them, Soka Gakkai is a really interesting example, since some of the leaders of Soka Gakkai were originally Buddhist and were actually locked up by the Kempeitai, by the secret police in the, up to 1945, as they became, legitimately pretty paranoid about government intervention. And so some of these in Soka Gakkai is a really good case. Actually have set themselves up like secret organizations. So they've set them up in what secret societies would call cells, where you've actually got someone that knows other people, but all the rest of the members in the cells only know the member of that cell. This again, on one hand, it's handy if you want to make sure you don't get wiped out by, whatever the new secret police are. But the other reason it works in Japan is ironically because each of these cells then becomes a new Oyabun Koban. In other words, the head of the cell becomes the new Oyabun, everyone in the cell becomes new Koban. So this becomes the new social network for folks, especially since once you become a member, you pretty much cut off your other social networks. In Soka Gakkai, these are called Zarankai. They're called network groups. Now, the key about these, and again, this is very, in this case, very Japanese, but it actually applies to most of the revitalization movements, is a lot of the stuff they do is actually outside religious stuff. So they have meetings maybe every a couple of days. They very rarely have it every day, but at least once a week at a minimum. And what happens is people bring up all their problems. The problems they're having at work. I wanted to buy this new car, but I can't afford it. I'm having health issues all of a sudden. All this stuff gets brought up in the Zarankai, in the cell, if you would, of the religion. And the members of the cell then help the person with the problem work through it. So more and more, this becomes your main social and emotional grounding group. Very powerful. So the centralized organization one really isn't traditionally Japanese in the sense of religion. It certainly is Japanese in the sense of sort of bureaucratic bureaucracy. But the Zarankai is a classic Japanese designed social support system, which the more and more you bind to the Zarankai, the more that you segregate yourself from non-members. Unlike the traditional religions, this is true globally, but especially with Buddhism and Shinto in Japan, you try to convert younger folks. So what you're looking at is the folks from the age of say 15 to 40, the folks that are coming to adulthood. They're having a hard time negotiating social networks. They don't have a good clear, especially nowadays. There may be any career path. They're feeling lost and largely alone. And the Soka Gakkai just sort of puts the arm around your shoulder and says, hey, look what we've got. We don't make any demands on you. We're going to give you a group of people that will just help you out. They'll support you. They'll be like your mom. So it's in a very amai type relationship where basically the group's there to help you out. And so what happens is the members of the group, the members of the cell become, basically children, and the senior member of the cell leader, becomes the mother or the elder. Incredibly effective, especially given Japanese social logic. One thing that's sort of interesting, this is one reason why revitalization movements are so successful compared to traditional religion. You see this classically in the United States. If you're part of a revitalization movement, you're expected to participate, whether it's a revivalist church, whatever it is. You go to services, you sing, you're involved, you do stuff. Probably have some sort of social service program, or you go around to houses and knock on doors and try to get people to join. So people are doing stuff. They're not passive religions. Traditionally, Buddhism and especially Shinto were very passive. On one hand, people as individuals with their ikigai would be involved in the religion, but they weren't really doing ceremonies and stuff. That would be done by a priest or a shaman or whoever. In the same way that the traditional Catholic Church, what you had was an audience. The actual participants would be the guys at the front of the altar, the priest, and whoever the guys are doing the work or the ceremony. The new religions don't do that. The new religions, you get involved. They want you to be involved, and I don't think they've consciously thought this through, but this becomes a large part of engagement. the more that you're involved, the more you buy into the group, the more you buy into the group, the more you're segregated by non-members. So again, notice how this whole thing just sort of becomes like a snowball going downhill. It just gains momentum and gains power. One of the other things they do, this is pretty typical of all of them, but you see this a lot, especially in Japan, is these large-scale ceremonies. Again, Soka Gakkai, I'm sure they probably still do them in Japan, though since they fragmented, I'm sure it's also smaller groups. But they would rent like the Tokyo Olympic Stadium, for like a whole week, and every day another chunk of the Sekigaikai population would show up to do stuff. So they'd have basically rotating ceremonies for different, they just run different different chunks of the population through on different days. And one of the huge things, one of the important things about this is it gives people a sense of just exactly how many people believe like they do. Because if there are many places, there's more non-believers around than there are believers. The only time they bump into believers is when the Zarankai is doing something, when they're hanging around with their new buddies, if you want to. Having these large-scale ceremonies, revival meetings, whatever they might be, tends to then reinforce the idea that, wow, I'm not alone. This is actually a really big thing. There's a lot of people involved, and they all believe, wow. And that again gets this engagement all fired up. So the new religions are really fascinating. There's been less discussion about them. I'm not sure they're any smaller. I think what's happening, especially in Japan, is they're fragmenting. I suspect a lot of them have gone online. In fact, I know for a fact a lot of them have gone online. So they don't require actual physical participation. So what you do is you set up like a Zoom group share, and that's how folks do it. But what that means is even harder to figure out how many people are involved. And I'm not sure how, when you do that, you have large public ceremonies. So, as parts of this are constantly dynamically changing because these new religions, because they're so simple to understand, they're also simple to basically split up into groups where you can basically say, well, you've only got 3 things you got to memorize. And all of a sudden, leader number 1 says you got, the important one's number 1. Leader number 2 says, well, the most important is actually number 3. And pretty sure certain what was one group has now split into two groups. The outsiders look the same, but the insiders is like, oh no, we believe in number 1. And then the other groups, oh no, we believe in number 3. And then you can see where that could then fragment even further. So the interesting thing about revitalization movements is they show up, they become really big. And then it's like they're not very well engineered, if you want to think of it that way, because of their simplicity. They're also very subject to fragmentation. So there's this sort of process that takes place. You certainly are seeing this in the United States, both of the far left political religious spectrum and the far right religious political spectrum. This is not unique. In Europe, probably even more so, I would think, in some ways. So let's take a look at some images to sort of, we'll finish up with. One of the complexities with new religions is they're having to deal with old religions. This is part of the Fushimi Inari Shrine in Kyoto that we mentioned before, the Fox Shrine, or the Inari Shrine. This is part of the famous, set of torii, literally thousands of torii that lead up to the top of the hill. Now, the key thing about that now is, I think this is definitely a school group here, would be, I think for a lot of folks nowadays, this is from about 10 years ago, I'm pretty sure for a lot of folks nowadays, this becomes, for this group of kids, this is it's a field trip. It's just like the kids that we saw in Takayama, the village. I'm not sure that a lot of them actually see this as a, quote, religious experience, unquote. It's just, it's a thing to do. You hang around with a group, your classmates, and you're doing this and you check this off. Some people might gain more insight. A lot of them, given the way Japanese do schooling, I can guarantee these kids were prepped with some sort of assignment before they came here, so they know they can rattle off maybe the history of what it was going. Given Japanese education, I bet you they can actually tell you how many, torii pillars, gates there are. But I'm not sure how engaged they are with the Inari spirit. I'm not sure how engaged they would be. We turned off right here. I think it was right up here where you see this different colored torii. That's where the cat sort of stopped us, and led us off to the side. So and I don't think the kids we were following noticed the cats, because the cat was sitting there. They just walked right by. They were on their phones, plus they were talking story and just sort of like goofing around doing field trip stuff. And I think that's one of the problems you get into. A lot of Buddhism and Shinto is based in locations, and it's based in places that are historically famous, and so people go there and they sort of check them off the bucket list. This is especially true in Buddhism. We have the books at home, but in Buddhism, in Japan, you actually have books. Well, in fact, you do in China too. You actually look like little diaries. And what you do is when you go to a Buddhist temple, they will actually stamp one page with the insignia of that temple, and one of the priests or the acolytes will actually then sort of sign it or initial it. And one of the things that traditionally had was part of the idea of pilgrimages, especially in Buddhism, was that you would fill the book up. I've never really been particularly clear what happens. I guess you just gain karma points would be my assumption, but what is what it is. But what's happened is especially in the last 30, 40 years, these have become tourist attractions, not only for non-Japanese who are visiting them as tourist attractions, but I think for a large portion of Japanese, and you see this the way they operate when they go to a shrine. It's very different than, say, the generation in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and older, who still see these shrines as important religious elements of their belief in life. Here's a formal set of wedding pictures. In many ways, this is modern Japanese society. Again, this is from about 10 years ago. This is at the Imperial Park in Kyoto. And what you see is the bride and groom. She's in the formal walking out outfit. And I should point out, my wife has one like this. These are actual brocaded silk. I have no idea how many hours it takes to do one of these things, but you keep them forever, basically. It says something really interesting in modern Japan that you can actually buy them. I think Ann Namba in Honolulu, she's actually made not a career so much, but she's actually sort of made a whole artistic statement. You can actually buy these things real cheap. You can go into a large department store, or even like a Daiso or something. Well, not a Daiso, but a Dai's in Kyoto or Osaka or something. They'll occasionally have used formal kimonos for sale. So you could buy an old one of these that have been used for a wedding, then stored, and then basically the families tossed it for maybe about $400 to $500. They're just works of art. The modern ones are all done with modern machinery. They actually do the stitching. The stitching isn't done by hand, but this looks like a traditional one, and he is in a traditional men's outfit. So these are what we call formal wedding pictures in Japan. Very much like their American counterpart, just different outfits. But the key here is they're doing this in front of the cherry blossoms. And again, given the age of these two folks, I'm not sure they really understand all the symbolism of the image that they're making. In modern Japan, these are oftentimes, photogenic memories that you're generating. But I'm not sure. I think he might have a better idea of why they're taking these pictures than the couple having the pictures taken does. And that's sort of modern Japan. And this is where the religiosity is sort of less, because the symbolic understanding of the world that you're in, I think, has sort of separated. Love this. This is the Shishibashi in Osaka. This is in front of a bar. But the interesting thing is what's above here, right? Let's see, I think it's right on this side. There's actually a really tiny one of those little Shinto letterbox shrines. So what you've got here is the maneki. But whereas manekis are supposed to be, they're usually manekis are seated there. They've got one hand up, and they're waving to you to either bring you into a place of business or to give you blessings, or both. Notice in this case, the maneki's drunk. He's crashed out with a cup of sake in front of him, so he's taking a snooze. And then over here, you've got the fox couple. This is actually very traditional. And I'm willing to bet that this is some sort of a poetic stanza, if you want to think of it, that has something to do with this. And given Osaka, which really specializes in sort of doing their own thing, I'm willing to bet that this is maybe part of an Osaka story or something. So this is actually, not only is this maneki old, this maneki, I would almost guarantee, survived World War II. But this whole scenario would probably only make sense to older Japanese. Younger Japanese would just see this. They might think the drunk cat is sort of cute, but I don't think they would really understand it. Again, of course, insiders and outsiders, Japanese being the way they are, the folks that have this shrine set up over here and put this here don't really care if people going by understand it or not. This is for insiders to understand and outsiders to sort of blankly look at or ignore, depending on their, what day of the week it is. Okay, this is an example of what's happened in a lot of Japan. This is in Kyoto. This is in one of the residential neighborhoods downtown. Well, in the urban core. But what you have here is a Shinto shrine. So part of the Shinto shrine is still intact. So the blessing area here is still intact. Back behind here, there's a small small bit of the shrine just intact. But this was actually the main functional part of the shrine. This has been converted into a yakitori / bar. And this is because there was no one keeping the. I talked to the owner, but he was saying, he's from the neighborhood. But what happened is by the 1970s, the only person who was wasn't really a priest, but the person in the neighborhood that was sort of keeping everything up got old, couldn't take care of it anymore. Folks in the neighborhood were just sort of like, yeah, well, I don't know. They would occasionally come here like New Year's and other stuff to do stuff at the side part. But no one was interested in spending the time, effort, and money to keep this up. And so it was abandoned, basically. And so he went and approached, the folks in the neighborhood, which of course is that network group, because Kyoto being Kyoto, they still have neighborhoods pretty strong. And he said, I'd like to take this over. Would you be offended if I, turned it into a da-da-da-da? And they went, no, why would we? We're not using it. It's probably going to get torn down. Another ugly 4-story walk-up high-rise is going to go in place. Like, yeah, so as long as, especially if you can keep it architecturally intact. So he did a really nice job. I mean, it's largely a walk-up bar. So it's got a section over here, which used to be the main shrine room, is actually now sit down area. He said it's pretty successful. I'm not sure he's making a lot of money, but he's happy with it. And he's, like he said, it gives him enough money to repair it. It has, this is actually almost a brand new roof, which would be really expensive. So, you've reused it. You reused a shrine. That happens occasionally. I'm not sure that happens much in other areas. In China, yeah, I don't know. In China, they turn them into tourist attractions, so they keep them open. I can't imagine reusing a shrine in China. In other parts like the United States, I don't know what you do with old churches. I think they generally get abandoned, torn down, unless another congregation comes in. But even then, given the American logic, if you had a new congregation, they wouldn't take an old church; they tear it down and put up a new church. So this is sort of a uniquely Japanese solution. The neighborhood still has its shrine that's over here. The neighborhood still has this structure, which was the shrine. So visually, they still have a complete package. It's just not being used for the same thing anymore. It's a very elegant, very Japanese solution, I think. Key thing here is it has nothing to do with tourism. This is by locals for locals, by the neighborhood for the neighborhood. And last, this is the new religion. Not too far from the really big Higashiyama shrine in Takayama. We were actually, this is the edge of the shrine. Come think of it. We were walking down from the shrine. This is on the road up to the back part of the shrine. So the Higashiyama shrine is on the front of this hill facing town. So Takayama's town is down here. If you would, that old tree is down here with the kami in it. We were coming up here and all of a sudden, bang, saw this, to one side. It's an odd structure in a bunch of ways. One is it's facing the wrong direction. It's facing sort of southeast, which is not how you orient shrines in Japan traditionally. Shrines in Japan are either based east-west, or in like the Takayama case, they're based on a hillside looking towards something. In the case of Higashiyama, it's oriented towards that large tree in the center of town. This is oriented towards nothing. Well, if anything, I guess it's oriented to Higashiyama Shrine, actually, when you think about it, because town's over this way, all the old Shinto stuff's over this way. So this is sort of at right angles to anything that's anything. This is one of these Soka Gakkai shrines. I wasn't sure at the time. I knew it was a new shrine. You can tell this whole complex is it's sort of very bureaucratic office looking when you think about it. Well, all of a sudden, smack, you've got this huge roof on top. Oh, there's a really surreal one in Tokyo, in Roppongi, which I forgot to take a picture of, which is really sort of creepy because it's absolutely huge. It's the size of a good sized stadium. And that's, again, I think that's one of the Soka Gakkai, was one of the Soka Gakkai Tokyo headquarters. I'm not sure what it is now since Soka Gakkai sort of split up. This is still in use. So one of the subgroups of Soka Gakkai obviously kept this as their, big thing. I expect this is probably their headquarters for this part of the, rural Japanese countryside around Takayama. But if you think about it, it's real different than the other stuff we saw. It's very modern. It's very look at me. It's not trying to integrate in the landscape. This is actually gold leaf on this, or some sort of gold like paint or something. So this is really making a big noise about da 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 da. And this again fits the new idea of revitalization religions. They make a big noise about themselves. They want to be seen. For believers, it reinforces their importance. For non-believers, it just sort of says, we're not part of you, you're not part of us. So this is, when you get to it, this is actually part of the paradox of modern Japan. Japan is very durable as long as things follow directions that people can make some sense of, that fit into their, worldview mindset. Probably more durable than other societies. This is why they made amazing amounts of change in the 19th century. And again, when you think of the post-World War II period, they really picked themselves up from the firebombed ruins of their whole country and built a brand new country out of it in less than 15 years. Mind-blowing success stories in some ways. But the key parts of the society, not too sure whether that same change has taken place. In other words, that resilience sort of has a cost, if you want to think of it. And I think the cost is that Japanese have very little flexibility when their existing mindset doesn't fit the reality of the world they find themselves in. I think one of the scary aspects of these new religions, there's invariably a real strong sense of Jihongi, of Japaneseness. This is viral. On one hand, Soka Gakkai actually has a real big following, or did have a big following, for example, in Honolulu. They had a big temple up in New Wano somewhere. But, it's on the other hand, these religions are very, very frequently are very nationalistic, very ethnocentric, which in Japan is sort of scary because this is that it's that geo-ethnocentrism. And I think this is one of the problems that Japan's getting into. As Japan moves more towards a world where, this is, maybe doesn't define Japan, but it certainly is in many ways sort of replacing traditional Shinto, traditional Buddhism, and the traditional sort of Japanese belief system with a much more simplified, much more sort of, low mental capacity to actually grasp it, requirements to the new religions. I think one of the things that this reflects is the changing attitude the Japanese have. But it also says that Japanese, as they have always been, are willing to distance themselves from what I would call the pragmatic functional realities of the world around them. So at the same time you've got this in place, at the same time you've got Japanese being Japanese, you've also got them in the last 5 years, basically, a significant proportion of folks doing social service type work in the areas around Takayama, especially dealing with elderly folks, dealing with, kids with education problems. A lot of the stuff that would be relatively low pay, but it requires hand-on teaching or hand-on, people being around, has been done by, Brazilian Japanese or folks here from Hawaii, large numbers of Canadians in Japan. So a lot of folks in Japan are not from Japan, but they've been providing a lot of these sort of entry-level social support system that keeps Japan functioning. Here in the countryside, in places like Takayama, they're a major part of the social network that allows old people, in their 90s or 100 years old or something like that, to live in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, and be comfortable that there's at least some sort of support system around. Japan in the last 5 years has gotten rid of all that. Japan in the last 3 years especially has been real aggressive about throwing out any foreigner who overstays their visa. They have to now prove they've got a reason for being in Japan. If you've got a business, if you're a foreigner and you have a business, even if you've got a green card business, you now have to have at least one Japanese employee who's full time, who's getting paid, pretty good salary, and usually supposed to have 1.5. I mean, not allowed to have extra foreign workers. So they've just made all these constraints, and basically what's happened is they're just chasing out a large portion, if not all, of the folks who aren't Japanese out of Japan, especially the ones providing these social services at the lower end of the rural areas. So especially Brazilian Japanese have taken it on the chin. A lot of them moved to Japan in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The economy was crappy in Brazil. They never integrated, effectively into Brazilian society. They're always segregated against. And so, the chance to go back to Japan, that's where the family largely had its, social roots. They still, vast majority of them spoke, Japanese as their first language. So going back to Japan was like a no-brainer for them. And they set up a life. And in some cases, especially in rural areas, they would marry Japanese. There's been some real interesting studies of non-Japanese marrying Japanese in rural areas. But those studies were all done prior to these new sanctions coming into effect. Large number of Filipinos actually have married Japanese men in rural areas, largely to provide support services for older family members. And again, now all these folks now find themselves, being deported, for lack of a better term. And it's going to have a huge crisis with the Japanese logic. Very similar to the American discussion about outsiders. The American one sort of spun slightly around the idea of illegal immigrants, so I use that in quotes. In the Japanese context, the vast majority of these folks aren't illegal. It's just the Japanese have decided to revoke what their status was. And they're not replacing it with anyone. It's not like you got a bunch of Japanese that want to leave the urban areas and go help old folks out in the countryside around places like Takayama, provide social services in a small town. No way. So what's happening is all these services are basically imploding. So Japan's basically, they've shot their foot off with a shotgun for reasons that really make no particular sense. There's been no national discussion about why this had to be done, why this was a logical thing to do. And yet what you don't see is any groundswell movement from Japanese that this has to be curtailed, that you're doing something really dumb. And this is sort of, what worries me about Japan is that Japanese have never been operational based on pragmatism, unlike the Chinese. Chinese society and Chinese individuals and families are very pragmatic when push comes to shove. Japanese never have been. Japanese have always been based in emotion and belief. I don't know what the emotion is about can't have anyone who's not Japanese around, but that's sort of where they've come to in their logic of the world around them. And I think it's a unsupportable, logic in a world that consists more and more of elders, and more of a very small, shrinking population, not only in terms of age groups, the percentage of the population under 20, for example, but just in total population. Japan's the most quickly depopulating country in the world. There's more deaths than births. So while you're getting rid of folks that are willing to move to your country, learn the language, and become, good members of the society, I have no clue. It's one of the mysteries that makes Japan an interesting place, but it's, more and more it's a place I would rather view from outside rather than being there inside, because I would think the anxiety and the zeitgeist would just be tremendously stressful because you just don't know. If you're not Japanese, you don't know. You don't know next week, next month, next year, what logic, because there's not a logic taking place here. This is emotional. So that's Japan. Two very different societies between this and China. They're dealing with the world we live in the 2020s in very, very different ways. Both of them carried a huge amount of baggage and dealing with things, either better or worse. But notice how totally different the systems are. That's one of the classic, stereotypes, and I especially get this now that I've moved to the mainland, is the idea of Asians. There's Asian markets. There's not Japanese markets or Chinese markets, and Asians are all sold to run one ball of wax. And it's just, you sit here and you look at these two societies and think that's like one of the dumbest things in the world. You very rarely would roll Greeks and Brits and Norwegians into one ball of wax. So whatever. So hopefully this was useful. Hopefully it was interesting.